welcome. Ms. Monica, Ms. Michelle, Chris, Abraham. We're all here today to basically inaugurate our Community Bridges series, a new series of workshops that is specifically focused on examining the impact of the civil rights era, the arts movements that were birthed out of that particular period in history, and their impact on our culture and society today. And to start us off, we're actually introducing a new component to these programs that we've done in the past, which is we're inviting people in our poet artist development program to help teach the workshops themselves. Today, this workshop is going to be led by Miss Michelle Smith, one of our more long-time, participants in various workshops, and now also one of the mentees in our poet artist development program. I'm very happy to have her here joining us today with her son Chris, and we'll get into some art and poetry. With that, I'd like to hand it over to Miss Michelle so that she can introduce herself.
Good morning and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for attending our workshop today. A day in which you could be outside the park, like we're here at Belvedere Park, barbecuing, going skating somewhere, however all of you are here. And thank you for being here today to celebrate the Civil Rights Movement with us in our series, which will exist until the 31st of August. Today, we're going to speak about the Civil Rights Movement, and you have a handout. One was sent to you via the email, but if not, we will make sure that's towards you. It looks like this, front and back, and it was emailed to you. We'll be happy to send you the additional copy if not received. And today we're going to speak about visionaries. A visionary, what do you think a visionary is? Could you answer the question, or I can tell that to you? Anybody in the audience? Don't be shy. A visionary is a person or an event that has marked throughout foresight and imagination. And before that occurs, with a vision, with the visionary, the vision is to be thought of first, which is the act of power of seeing. Not just through the eyes, your mind, but also your heart and soul. It's a thought or concept or object formed by the imagination. Power acts as the imagination. Through the Civil Rights Movement that existed from 1948 to 1965 for 17 years, we all have learned about the injustices and you also gain freedom through people and events that were sacrificed to get to that point. We're going to speak about 3 people and an event that occurred that are shaped by their influences by these events and each individual person as to why they are all known as visionaries, their vision, and how acts of the Civil Rights Movement and what occurred has influenced them to be who they were today, even though they're not here except for one and a few. We will start with a woman who has this quote: "If I fall 5 feet 4 inches forward, if I fall, I will fall 4 feet inches forward for the right of freedom." We are speaking about a beautiful woman who is an activist for civil rights, for freedom, and the right to vote, as well as being a community activist and somebody very special who was influenced during her time. Her name was Fannie Lou Hamer. Fannie Lou Hamer, Hamer. She was born October 6, 1917, and passed away March 14, 1977. And through her vision, she was originally from Philadelphia, Mississippi, in the Deep South, and her purpose was to have people in her community to vote, because people in the community, primarily African Americans or Black Americans, were denied that right to vote, which was in existence in 1957 and implemented by President Eisenhower. However, people in this state and city, in these towns, were denied the right to vote because of, quote unquote, not being educated, or allegedly not being smart enough to pass with a test of 6th grade and above, according to people who are racist. And unfortunately, that happened for several years, even though that voting implemented act by Eisenhower was passed. Caucasian people who were racist felt as if black people were not entitled to vote and considered second-class citizens. Miss Hamer was also a mother, a wife, mother, aunt. She also ran for the Congressional Congress for the Democratic Committee. She also was involved with SNCC, which stands for the Student Nonviolence Charismatic Committee, to help with nonviolence and to act in a way to help people of all colors who are also discriminated against to see those rights. In addition, we have another person that will speak, another event that we'll talk about that occurred in the 1960s, from 1960 to 1963. Has anybody heard of the Freedom Riders at all? Anybody? The Freedom Riders were a group of people who came from all walks of life. Black, white, people who felt that the injustices from equality and equity was not being served because of segregation in the South and other parts of this nation. The Freedom Riders were people who sacrificed their time and their lives in situations that occurred, including such things as burning the churches, burning and bombing the churches. They also were protesting the sit-ins and shut-ins at the Woolworth's counter to be served. When the Greensboro four African-American men, actually 2 women and 2 men, were not served at the counter because of prejudice and racism. Of course, they can go use the bathroom that said colored or be served on the outside, but they were not served with the dignity and respect as white people or other people because of the fact that they're black. So therefore, in that situation, the Freedom Riders grew immensely. It grew to the point where all colors of people, primarily white and black, joined forces together to include that and remember to enforce integration, not segregation. So therefore, when that occurred, the group got larger and larger and larger. As you see in your handout, there are movies that are at the bottom here, and the word Freedom Fighter is one of them. There's a movie called Selma. If you saw the movie Selma, that was done in 2014, that primarily took place in Selma, Alabama, where people walked hand in hand, force by force, and not force by force, but hand in hand, beautifully and unified about racism and prejudice happening in their state as well. And the Freedom Fighters were instrumental in that as well, because many people of that group supported that and walked hand in hand, arm in arm. It's not Martin Luther King or Ralph Abernathy, but there were also 6 people who also were involved with that called the Big Six. I can't name them all, but you please look it up on Wikipedia for the Civil Rights Movement. As in the movie called Mississippi Burning, and then the movie called Freedom Fighters, as well as Selma, all those movies have one thing in common: to help freedom, to establish freedom and civil rights for people who are justly served based on the color of his or her own skin, which is unfair. Our other aspect of the Civil Rights Movement influence includes art and culture. We have 2 artists that were influenced by the Civil Rights Movement. One of them is named Charles White, and the one here, my son Christopher Akubuilo. Charles White was born in 1918 and died in 1979 before he was 60 years old. He would have been 61 years old had he lived. And had he lived today, he would have been 103. So therefore, can you imagine a 103-year-old who was gone, if he would have lived today, who's gone to that history, and has continued that with his art? His artwork is prolific because at some point, it couldn't be seen within his neighborhood at different museums. But as I said previously, his artwork is globally in existence today. There's a school on Wilshire Boulevard in Los Angeles called Charles White Elementary, named in his honor. He has museums of his artwork within America as well as the world. In fact, there's artwork by him at the Museum of MoMA. I can't think of it right now, but I'm going to say the Museum of
Modern Art.
Civil Art in New York City. So for anybody in New York, take a look at it. You'll be proud and pleased. Anyway, I'm going to show you his artwork that he has. As you see here, there's an example of his artwork that is called Wonder Poster Series 14A. If you look at the first part, we're going to contrast and compare art. There's a young man. To me, he looks like he's elementary school age, preteen perhaps. It says 1619. 1619 is the first year that the slave trade occurred in Jamestown, from Africa to Jamestown, Virginia. And on the other side is another photograph. This is 19 and two question marks. So what can that tell you? We all know of a different perception as well as perspective. But to me and to you, it can be something totally different. Now we all know that Mr. White passed away in 1979. So he did not live in the year 2000 plus. So therefore, if he had lived, will this be 2000 something with question marks? We don't know, do we? But it stands to wonder, are we truly wanted versus not wanted in the society? And there's another poem, prophet. An African American man is praying for reflection on the rose, which is nature, and it's also prolific because of the fact that it shows his contributions to the American Negro democracy back in that point. So therefore, this is another reason why his artwork is prolific and important, because he wanted his artwork to be not just in America and all over the world, but to signify a purpose. And it does show a purpose. It shows to like your blood you have in your veins or the air you breathe. It's essential. So therefore, his work is essential. Without his work, this is an artist that can influence anybody. And I feel at one point he did influence my son, Christopher Akubuilo, where you see his art in a moment. As you see, the yellow one, that's an artwork of Christopher, an African American, a Black American artist, who was a student at the ECF Studio Arts LA program. He's been an artist there since 2014, and he loves to create art. In addition to that, you see the contrast of the one man versus the two people in Charles White artwork. And this is all the one called Prophet. The other one on the right-hand side has no title, however, it speaks volumes because of the fact that there is color blue in both photographs, the colors are pink, and that the men are bald. So does that mean that they're handsome? Absolutely they're handsome. I'm being biased, but they're absolutely handsome. And I feel that influenced my son's work in regards to seeing that artwork. That's his Prophet. However, I will also say that the name Christopher and Charles have three things in common. They both have things in common. Charles and Christopher, their first names begin with CH. CH. The name Charles is a name for an old English name that means free man. Isn't that ironic? That we're still free? He's a free man. Or the name Charles means a free man. Biblically, the name Charles also means strong and manly. His artwork is strong and definitely manly. As for the name Christopher, Christopher is the name that's Greek for the bearer of Christ. And my son does love the Lord. However, all the artwork here from both of them is prolific. And yes, Charles and Christopher did and do wear eyeglasses, as well as being African American men. So therefore, that also signifies to me that Christopher enjoys his artist. In fact, he received these gifts. He received this gift here. It has not been opened. I have not opened it for reasons. You see it's 2 years old, but this is Charles White's artwork through a calendar. I didn't open it. I encouraged Christopher not to open it. I thought it was important for him not to open it. And so, this is art right here. The picture that's in front is showing Sojourner Truth and Booker T. Washington. This is the New York Museum of Art in Newark, New Jersey. And Charles White was born in Chicago, Illinois, and Christopher was born in Los Angeles, California, both large cities in this country. And this is the other artwork that he did as well. This is under the beautiful artwork of Charles White. Prolific work that speaks volumes because of the fact that these are artworks that are in our image. Our image. Our image. So therefore, it's important to discuss these artifacts because in this society, even though it is 2022, people of color, BIPOC, are still discriminated against, unfortunately. It's not about the racism that occurs, it's the fact that the harmony is not there, or it's there or not there. And I'm not just saying that in my opinion, but we see this all the time. We see this for racial profiling. We know that happened to George Floyd. We know that despicable act that the whole world saw. We know about Rodney King. We know that, for instance, my son, he is autistic. In the 1990, President Bush the father, signed into law the ADA, or American Disability Act, which is important and a part of the civil rights movement because it champions how people with disabilities should have a right in this country to be free like everybody else. Mm-hmm. However, my son is a BMA to me, black, male, and autistic. And as you see, you've seen Christopher. He's a man that either, if he doesn't say anything or speak to him, if you don't know him, you don't know who he is. All you see on the surface is a black man, a big black man. And in this society, it's either a curse or a blessing. Either it is a liability or an asset. Well, as a parent, you already know my answers. However, in society, autism and being African American person with a disability, this is 2022. Embrace it, live with it, because it's part of your neighborhood. And that's just how it is. Period. People who are autistic, who have autism, who are developmentally disabled, that's what it was called back then when it was diagnosed in 1988. It's still considered now a disability. Back then, in earlier years, it's probably called handicapped, or put him in an institution and let him thrive. Well, he's thriving well through his art, through his passions, and he's thriving here at DSTL Arts. And that makes me happy as a parent. Of course, I'm being biased, but I'm being honest. I'd like to ask you a question. In your neighborhood today, can you write a list of words that describe the vision for your community? Can you do that for yourselves and feel that vision? How does your vision in your community feel when you think about the word vision? Are the visionaries in your neighborhood? Are the visions in your neighborhood? Are the things that you want to change? Things that you like or don't like? This is America, and everybody should be free. Like Fannie Lou Hamer said, if nobody's free, if anybody's not free, if one person's not free, we're all not free. Again, if one person's not free, we're all not free. That quote I said that quote incorrectly, but that's a quote that she said.
Ladies and gentlemen, Miss Michelle Smith. One of the main reasons why we're conducting these workshops is because the workshops themselves are really designed to give people an opportunity to express their own vision for their community, and also to reflect on the past and the vision that people had in the past about what it meant to be a person of color. Not just black people, but all people of color through the civil rights era benefited in one form or another, and also had their own awakening and empowerment. Therefore, the reason for this workshop and the location and looking at Chris's work in comparison to Charles White's work is because things, even though they are different, things have been updated. There is some improvement in terms of our status in this society. As people of color, we've always had a particular vision for ourselves, and it's really on us to tell that story. But in order for us to really be able to understand that part of our history, we need to revisit some important things that actually are relevant to not just the civil rights era, but to the different arts movements that occurred during that time period. For that, I'm going to refer to one of the handouts that was produced for this particular series. The handout itself is available on our website. If you go to dstilarts.org, you can actually find it on our website, along with eventually the recording for today's session and the handout that's specific to today's session as well. But this particular handout that we're looking at right now on the screen, for those that are watching this later, and for our Ms. Smith who's joining us via Google Meet, you'll see here, this is a very brief overview, a very brief history of the civil rights movement. And we're not going to go into too much detail. Ms. Michelle already gave us a lot to consider. But the civil rights movement does actually technically begin with the desegregation of the armed forces in 1948. From 1948 all the way through to approximately 1969 is the era that's defined as the Civil Rights era. However, that does not mean that the Civil Rights era or that civil rights themselves were actually put into effect at that point, even though there were laws that were obviously enacted to overcome the challenges that were presented to us as people of color. But we move on to the Brown versus Board of Education and the integration of public schools. Of course, there's a very important moment in the murder of Emmett Till and the publication of his body through Jet magazine in 1955. And from there we go on to all of the different boycotts from the time of Rosa Parks and the boycott in Montgomery, Alabama, through to the integration of various colleges and elementary schools, and so on and so forth. And ultimately, with the Civil Rights era, the Voting Rights Act that was enacted in, I believe, 1964, that was to establish, that was established in, 1964 was the Civil Rights Act that established the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission to prevent workplace discrimination. That was a pretty major one. Of course, there's also the Voting Rights Act and so on and so forth. Like I said, there's a lot to go through on this particular handout that's presented on the screen right now, but I highly recommend that if you have a chance, go through it and really try to understand the context in which the art movements that we're about to discuss were actually present. The context is important because, of course, context means everything in the art world. Because of the Civil Rights era, many artists felt inspired and empowered by the messages that were being transmitted by the people that were essentially the leaders in the Civil Rights movement. Civil rights needed to take on multiple prongs in terms of multiple approaches for teaching people the value of our communities. One of those ways is obviously through culture and art. And the cultural arm that was typical of most movements within that period, developed because of the stance in social equity, equality across not just only race, but also gender and sexual orientation and a lot of different things that also came out of that era. The Black Arts movement in particular was something that started within the 70s, late 60s into the 70s, and Charles White's work was certainly a precursor and also a contemporary of the Black Arts movement, specifically in the representation of black bodies and black men, as we saw in the handout that we were reviewing earlier. The Black Arts movement was very much about black love and black pride, black power, trying to express things like the cultural connection to Africa and Pan-Africanism. Even if individuals were not able to say, I'm specifically from this region, this country in Africa, people were still trying to embrace that aspect of themselves and merge it with what is ultimately the culture of the United States, because black culture has always been one of those things that has driven pop culture in the United States. Other notable artists, aside from Charles White, that you could consider as part of the Black Arts movement include people like James Baldwin, Amiri Baraka, also known as Leroy Jones, Nikki Giovanni, Maya Angelou, and many, many more. In the writing world, there's definitely good examples, but also in the music world, like James Brown and people like the Isley Brothers, a lot of their songs during that time period also reflected the Black Arts movement. For other people of color, such as Latinos, specifically Chicanos, being that Mexicans and Mexican Americans were at the time a majority ethnic group from Latin America represented in the United States, you have the Chicano movement. The Chicano movement was specifically looking to express a sense of brown pride and a revitalization of culture, something that was maybe sort of shunned or looked down upon because of what happened during the the World War II era and the Zoot Suit riots and the general sense of what a Pachuco meant. So with the Chicano movement, that was sort of taken on again and reimagined as the idea or the sense of brown pride. Most elements of the Chicano movement did focus on things like immigrant and farm worker rights, and there were certainly a lot of writers and artists that came out of that era that impact our view of Chicano art today. Specifically, like Corky Gonzalez, Rodolfo Anaya, Harry Gamboa, Barbara Carrasco, and Judith Hernandez. In addition to the Chicano movement, we also have the American Indian movement, which was about red power. Ultimately, you know, or not realizing, but empowering and helping individuals from the American Indian tribes really feel like they had a place in the United States and a place where their culture could continue. Hence, the ideas that really drove that movement were, centered on cultural continuity and tribal sovereignty, especially because of all the broken treaties that occurred ever since the colonial era of the United States. There's also the Asian American movement, which was about bringing together different ethnic groups within the Asian diaspora. Things like, being anti-war and anti-imperialist were also important elements of that particular movement, because of obviously the impact of the Vietnam War in people of color's communities and also in the way in which Asian communities were ultimately stigmatized because of that. And then there's also the gay liberation movement, which was a very important movement within the time period that really tried to express the idea of the personal as political, which was a feminist concept that carried over into the gay communities, basically embracing of who they are as people without any kind of shame for being who they are, which I think all communities of color really were ultimately trying to get at as well. Now, as the civil rights era moved on, and as these arts movements moved on, some of them did continue and thrive into the 70s, and some of them into the 80s. However, because of mainstream media and the representation of people of color in general, being kind of slow to change, some of those movements did not continue past the 80s. Also, some of them were in some ways sort of self-sabotaging by being non-inclusive, meaning that, they focused a lot on the masculine side of a particular identity, really reducing the impact of women in different cultures, as well as not being representative of all the different types of, gender identities and sexual orientation that are, obviously part of being anyone. Therefore, moving on into the 90s and globalization, the introduction of the internet, a lot of the movements of the past, they were deemed basically non-relevant anymore because of the way that global society has started to shape. However, for us as people of color, as we continue to think about our own place in this world, a lot of us, depending on the time period in which you grew up, and even younger generations who are really just now starting to understand the impact of being a person of color in society, these movements from the past, they're starting to have a sort of resurgence, but now with new elements added to it, elements that incorporate intersectionality. Intersectionality ultimately means the recognition that we are more than just one simple thing. Our race, our class, our ethnicity, our gender, our sexual orientation, all of those things combine together to make who we are. And it's that combination that ultimately represents a story, a part, an element of our community. So this series in particular is really hoping to get people to think about how those movements from the past influence them as artists now. That's why we're asking the question today, what is a visionary? What is a vision? And as part of that, we invite you to create your own vision board. It's pretty simple to create a vision board. Ultimately, all you really need is just some basic collaging materials, magazines, newspapers, maybe a piece of paper to put it all together using glue. You can obviously illustrate, you can even incorporate writing. That's why in the other handout that we provided, we give you a space to write a list of words that describe your vision for your community. Because ultimately, that's what we're challenging you to do. Create something that expresses your unique vision for your community. And that can mean a lot of different things. Because remember, you're more than just one person, one part of a community. You actually belong to multiple communities. And in that way, all those communities converge to become one larger community. I encourage you to check out our website, DSTLARTS.org, to get more details about the anthology that we hope to produce through this particular series of workshops. The submission period is now open. You're able to send in either poetry, short stories, flash fiction. We're also accepting comics, visual art, and photography, all of which would be hopefully inspired by the civil rights era and its impact on society today. Thank you for joining us, and I hope to see some of your artwork soon.